dinner table that night was set, the way my mother always sets it when she wants things to feel significant. The good china, the cloth napkins she irons the night before, the candles and the brass holders that came from my grandmother's house in Sudbury, which my mother carried in a cardboard box on her lap all the way down the 400 because she didn't trust them in the trunk. My brother was sitting across from me, laughing at something my uncle had said, and he looked the way he always looked at family dinners. Slightly relaxed, slightly distant, like a man who had learned to be present without being entirely there. We were celebrating his promotion. That was what we had been told, a senior position at the clinic in Vancouver. More responsibility, more travel, more of everything that made my parents lean forward in their chairs when he talked. My husband was sitting beside me. He had been quiet most of the evening, which was not unusual for him. He is a careful person. He works in forensic accounting, which means his entire professional life is built around noticing the things that don't fit. He does not talk about work at dinner parties. He pours his wine slowly and he listens. He had been listening all evening. At some point, after my father had raised his glass and said something about perseverance and hard work, and my mother had pressed her hand to her chest the way she does when she is trying not to cry, my husband leaned slightly toward me. He didn't look at me, he kept his eyes on my brother. He said quietly without moving his lips very much, "Some of this doesn't line up." I didn't say anything. I picked up my water glass and I took a slow sip, and I looked at the candle in the center of the table, and I thought about what he had just said, and what it would mean if he was right. My brother's name is Adrian. He is 4 years older than me. He grew up the way some older siblings grow up in families like ours, as proof of something. Proof that the sacrifices had been worth it, that the long hours and the tight budgets and the moves and the adjustments had added up to something real. My parents came to Canada from the Philippines when Adrian was 3, and I was not yet born. My father worked in industrial maintenance. My mother worked in a laundry facility attached to a hotel in Mississauga, and later at a dry cleaning shop closer to where we lived. Neither of them ever complained about this in front of us, and I understood why only much later. Adrian was bright. He was the kind of student whose teachers called my parents to tell them so, which I know meant something to my mother and father in a way that is hard to explain if you didn't grow up watching your parents try to feel at home in a country that made them feel the effort of belonging every single day. He was going to be a doctor. That was not something that was said often or loudly. It didn't need to be. It was simply a fact of our household, the way the weather is a fact, the way the mortgage is a fact, the way the mortgage is a fact. Adrian would go to medical school. Adrian would go to medical school. Adrian would become a doctor. He went to the University of Toronto. He studied biology. He was accepted to a post-baccalaureate program in health sciences, which he explained to my parents was a step on the road to medical school. My father worked extra shifts that year. My mother took in alterations on the side, things she did at the kitchen table after dinner, fabric and thread and her reading glasses and the small lamp she kept there for exactly that purpose. I was 17 at the time. I remember the lamp. Adrian moved to Vancouver when I was 19. He told us he had been accepted to a graduate program there, and that an MD program would follow. He called home every Sunday. He always had something to say, some detail about a seminar or a supervisor or a clinic rotation that sounded exactly like what our parents needed to hear. I believed him. Why wouldn't I have believed him? He was my brother. He had always been the serious one, the one who read ahead, the one who stayed after class. There was no version of my brother that included lying to us. It simply wasn't in the architecture of who I thought he was. He came home for Christmas. He came home for Easter. He sent photos sometimes of the city, of mountains, of coffee shops. Normal things. The photos of him always looked like what you'd expect a graduate student to look like. Tired, a little pale, wearing the same 3 sweaters in rotation. Years passed. He was always just finishing something, always just at the edge of the next stage. The MD program was starting in the fall. The residency applications were going in next month. There had been a delay with the licensing paperwork. There was a position at a clinic in North Vancouver that was coming together. My parents asked fewer questions as time went on. I think they had learned not to. The updates were always reassuring and the details were always just vague enough that there was nothing specific to push against. I got married 5 years ago. My husband and I settled in Hamilton. I work in communications for a mid-sized nonprofit. My life is ordinary in ways that feel like exactly what I wanted after a childhood that was full of pressure that I was only peripherally attached to. The pressure was always pointed at Adrian. The night of the dinner, the promotion was supposed to be the last piece of the story falling into place. Senior coordinator at a medical clinic, a real salary, benefits, a title that my mother could explain to her friends at church. Not a doctor exactly, but close enough that the story made sense, that the years of education could be understood as leading somewhere, that the investment had returned something. My parents glowed at that table. I watched my father look at my brother, and I know my father. I know the particular way he holds himself when he feels that he has done something right by his children. There is a straightness in his shoulders, a quietness around his eyes. He looked that way all evening. My husband noticed the things he noticed. Later, when we were washing dishes together while my parents watched something in the other room and my brother was on the phone outside on the porch, I asked him what he meant. He dried a plate carefully before he answered. He said the clinic Adrian mentioned doesn't appear to have a senior coordinator role listed anywhere in the way Adrian described it. He said the credential Adrian referenced as part of his background, a particular certification from a program in BC, had a course structure that didn't match the timeline Adrian had given. He said he wasn't sure about any of it, but that when he hears a story and the pieces don't sit right, he notices. I said maybe he had the details mixed up. He said maybe. He put the plate in the cupboard. He said, "It's probably nothing, I just wanted to mention it." He didn't say anything else about it. But I thought about it for the rest of the night, and I thought about it on the drive home, and I thought about it for 3 days after that, turning the details over the way you turn something in your hand when you're trying to figure out what it is. I called my brother on a Tuesday evening. I told myself I wasn't investigating anything. I told myself I was just calling to catch up, that I was curious, that there was nothing accusatory in any of it. I had rehearsed the conversation in my head so many times that by the time I actually dialed, I felt exhausted by it. He answered on the third ring. He sounded like himself. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, about the drive back to Hamilton, about a TV series he'd been watching, about our mother's plan to repaint the hallway. Then I asked him about the clinic. I asked casually. I asked the way you ask someone about a job when you're just interested, when you just want to understand what their days look like. He answered the way he always answered, smoothly, with enough detail to feel real, moving past specific questions by expanding into adjacent ones. He was good at it. I noticed for the first time that he was good at it. I said, "What's the name of the certification you mentioned at dinner?" I was trying to explain it to a friend and I couldn't remember exactly. There was a pause. Not a long one, but it was there and I felt it. He gave me a name. I wrote it down. I looked it up after we hung up. The program existed, the timeline didn't. To complete that certification the way Adrian had described, he would have needed to begin it 2 years before he told us he had finished his graduate degree. The overlap wasn't possible. I sat with my laptop on the kitchen table for a long time. The house was quiet. My husband was in the other room. I could hear the low sound of something on his laptop, something with voices, some documentary he'd been meaning to watch. I thought about my father's face at the dinner table. I thought about the lamp. I drove to Vancouver on a long weekend in October. I told Adrian I wanted to visit, that I hadn't been out there in years, that I wanted to see his place and spend some time in the city. He seemed pleased. He made a reservation at a restaurant in Kitsilano for Saturday night. I spent Friday walking around. I found the clinic. I stood across the street from it for about 10 minutes, feeling like someone doing something I couldn't fully justify. Then I went to a coffee shop nearby and sat there for an hour. I didn't go in. I didn't ask anyone anything. I had no plan. I had only the feeling that I needed to be close to it, to make it real rather than theoretical, to understand what it was before I said anything to anyone. Saturday night, at the restaurant, Adrian was warm and funny and attentive. He asked about my work, about my husband, about my parents. He ordered thoughtfully. He was the best version of himself. Toward the end of dinner, after we had been talking for almost 2 hours, I put my fork down. I said his name. He looked at me. I said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that I'm asking because I love you, not because I'm trying to catch you in anything." His face changed. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. a stillness that moved across his expression like a cloud moving across flat ground. There and then, partly gone, and then present again in the set of his jaw. He said, "Okay." I said, "How are things actually going?" He looked at his wine glass. He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I mean, are you actually a senior coordinator at the clinic? I mean, does what you're doing look the way you've described it to Mom and Dad? I mean, are you okay?" He was quiet for long enough that the restaurant continued around us, other tables talking, a server passing, music I hadn't noticed until just then. Then he said, "No." He didn't say it all at once. It came out in pieces over the next hour, and then on a walk after we left the restaurant, along the seawall, with the lights of the North Shore across the water, and the cold coming off the inlet, and both of us with our hands in our pockets. He had been accepted to the health sciences program at UBC. That part was true. He had completed 2 years of it. In the 3rd year, he had fallen apart in a way he hadn't been able to explain to himself at the time, and still couldn't entirely explain to himself at the time, and still couldn't entirely explain now. Something had accumulated. The pressure, the isolation, the sense that he had boxed himself so completely into a future that he had never actually chosen, that there was no longer any oxygen in it. He had stopped going to class in November of that year. He had told no one. He had spent months trying to get back on track. He registered for courses he didn't attend. He applied to programs he didn't pursue. He told our parents he was finishing up his coursework, that the MD program had moved its intake timeline, that he was waiting on paperwork. And then a year had passed, and another, and the lie had grown the way things grow when you stop looking at them. Not dramatically, not with any single decision, just steadily, incrementally, by the compounding weight of all the things that had already been said and couldn't be unsaid. He had found work. That was also true. He had worked at the clinic, but as administrative staff, not in any clinical or credentialed role. He had taken on more responsibility over the years, had become genuinely good at what he did. The promotion in some narrow technical sense was real. He had moved into a coordinator role, a management role, something he had earned through 8 years of showing up and being competent. But it was not what our parents thought it was. It was not what any of us had thought it was. He sat on the seawall, looking at the water. I kept thinking I was going to fix it. I kept thinking there was going to be some version of this where I found a way back, where I could make it true eventually, where I could tell you all something that made the years make sense. He said, "I didn't know how to tell Dad. I didn't know how to sit in front of him and say that I had spent his money and his overtime and everything he worked for, and I had not." He stopped. I waited. He said, "I didn't know how to be the person who did that." I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bed in the spare room of his apartment, and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about all of it. About the Christmases, about my mother's hand pressed to her chest, about my father's shoulders at the dinner table, about the lamp. I thought about how long he had carried this alone, 9 years. 9 years of Sunday phone calls and holiday dinners and casual conversations and the daily maintenance of something that had no end and no exit. I thought about what it costs a person to do that, not just emotionally, though that too, but in the simpler sense, what it takes out of you, every single day, to be someone you are not. To monitor what you say, to keep the details consistent, to hear your father talk about your accomplishments to his friends and to stand there and receive it. I thought about my husband saying quietly, "Some of this doesn't line up." I thought about what it meant that my brother had stayed. He hadn't disappeared. He hadn't disappeared. He hadn't cut contact, hadn't drifted away, hadn't done what would have been, in some ways, the easier thing. He had come home every Christmas. He had answered every Sunday call. He had stayed close even as the distance inside the closeness grew. I thought that meant something. I wasn't sure yet what to do with any of it. I knew what I thought had to happen next. I knew it could not be me who made it happen. But I also knew I couldn't go home and sit with this the way I had been sitting with the smaller version of it for the past 6 weeks. I called Adrian the next morning from the airport. I said I wasn't going to tell our parents. I said that wasn't my story to tell. But I said he had to tell them, and that I would help him, and that I thought it needed to happen before the end of the year. He said he knew. He said he had known for a long time that this was where it had to go. He said he just hadn't been able to find the door. I said maybe we could find it together. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Do you think Dad will be okay?" I thought about my father. I thought about who my father actually is, separate from the version of him that I had been so afraid of in my imagination all those years. My father, who came to a country where he knew very few people and built a life with careful hands. My father, who never once that I can remember spoke badly of someone who had failed at something they had tried hard at. My father, who used to say that the work itself was the point, that the credential was just the paper, that what mattered was the kind of person the work made you. I said, "I think Dad might surprise you." We told him in December, at the house in Mississauga. Adrian sat at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table where my mother used to sit with the lamp and the alterations, and he told them. He started at the beginning. He didn't leave things out. He told them about the third year, about falling apart, about not knowing how to say it, about the years that followed. He told them about the job, about what he had actually built, about what he was actually good at. He told them about the certification he had completed on his own, legitimately, 3 years ago, because he had wanted something real in his hands. My mother cried. My father sat very still. When Adrian finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that I counted my own heartbeats to have something to do. Then my father said his name. He said, "You've been working this whole time." Adrian said yes. My father said, "You built something." Adrian said he thought so. He said it wasn't what they had imagined. He said he was sorry. He said the word sorry several times in different ways as though he were trying to find the exact shape of it. My father got up from his chair. He is not a demonstrative man. He does not hug easily or often. He walked around the table, and he put his hand on the back of Adrian's neck, the way he used to when Adrian was small, when he would come in late from playing and find us both still up at the kitchen table. He said, "This is something you carried too long alone." That was all he said. My mother came around the table a moment later, and she held Adrian for a long time while he sat in the chair, and I looked out the window at the backyard, at the bare tree at the back of the property that loses its leaves every October and comes back every spring without anyone asking it to. There were harder conversations after that. The money had to be spoken about. My father had spent years supplementing what he thought were Adrian's education costs, and that debt was not invisible, and it needed to be addressed as a real thing between real people, not managed or minimized. Adrian asked how much it had been over the years, and my father told him the number, and Adrian wrote it down. He said he would pay it back. He said it would take time. My father said he did not need to. Adrian said he did. That conversation lasted a long time and ended without full resolution, the way some important conversations do. But it was open, and it was honest, and it was between two people who knew what they were actually talking about. My mother asked what came next. Adrian said he had been thinking about a different kind of program. There were healthcare administration degrees, accelerated ones, designed for people already working in the sector. Not medicine, not what the original plan had been, but something real that built on what he actually knew. My mother nodded slowly. She asked if he was happy in Vancouver. He said most of the time he was. She said that was enough to start with. I drove home to Hamilton that night. My husband was awake when I got in, reading in the living room with the floor lamp on and a cup of tea going cold on the side table. He looked up when I came in. He didn't ask how it went right away. He just looked at me in that way he has, where the question is there without pressure, where he is willing to wait as long as I need. I sat down on the couch beside him. I said, "He told them." He said, "How did it go?" I thought about my father's hand on the back of Adrian's neck. I thought about my mother at the table. I thought about Adrian writing down a number in a small notebook he had taken out of his jacket pocket. That simple, deliberate act, the willingness to make it concrete, to not look away from it. I said, "Better than I expected, and I expected it to go okay." My husband nodded. He picked up his tea. He said, "Good." That was it. He didn't say "I told you so," didn't revisit the dinner, didn't make it about the moment at the table when he had leaned toward me and said those words that had started all of this. He is not that kind of person. He noticed what he noticed, he said what he said, and then he let it go. I sat there for a while in the quiet of our house. I thought about what it must have cost my brother, all those years. Not just the performance of it, though that was real and enormous, but the specific loneliness of it. The way a secret that size doesn't just sit inside you but slowly rearranges everything else around it. The way you can be in a room full of people who love you and still be entirely alone because the thing they love is something you built to be loved instead of something you actually are. I thought about the Sunday phone calls. I thought about how he kept showing up anyway. Every holiday, every family dinner, every drive down the 400 with our parents' good china in a cardboard box and the careful way we carry the things we can't afford to break. He came back every time. And when he finally couldn't keep the distance between himself and the truth any longer, he sat at the kitchen table and he told them who he actually was, and they loved him anyway. And the thing he had been most afraid of turned out to be the thing that made room for something real. I don't think the fear was foolish. I want to be clear about that. The pressure that shaped it was real. The expectations were real. The weight my parents carried to build the life they built was real. And Adrian felt the obligation of that as something close to sacred, close to a debt that could only be paid one specific way. But the debt, it turned out, could be paid in other currencies. Honesty, presence, the willingness to sit in a chair and say the true thing and stay in the room while it lands. He had always been there. That, I think, was what my father was really saying when he put his hand on the back of his son's neck and said, "You carried this too long alone." He was saying, "You are here. You are always here." That was the part that mattered. I keep thinking about the notebook. The small one Adrian pulled from his jacket pocket when my father said the number out loud. The way he uncapped a pen and wrote it down without flinching. That one gesture, more than anything else that happened that December, told me who my brother actually was underneath all the years of performance. Because here's what I've come to understand. Sitting with this story long enough to see its shape, the consequences didn't arrive the night the truth came out. They had been accumulating for years, quietly, in the body of a man who couldn't sleep easily, couldn't be fully present, couldn't let anyone get too close to the details. The cause was the lie. The effect wasn't one dramatic moment of collapse. It was 9 years of a smaller life, a life lived at a careful distance from the people he loved most. That distance was the cost, and it was enormous, even if no one could see the bill. What strikes me now is that my brother is not a dishonest person. That sounds like a strange thing to say, but I mean it. He is someone who, at 22, lacked the courage to disappoint the people who had sacrificed so much for him. And I understand that. I think most of us would struggle in that same room, with that same history behind us. The failure wasn't moral rot, it was a failure of nerve at a particular moment, followed by a compounding series of smaller failures to correct it. Understanding the difference matters. It doesn't erase the harm, but it shapes how you respond to it. What my brother eventually showed, by sitting at that kitchen table, was something I think is harder than most people give it credit for. He chose to be honest, not when it was safe, or easy, or when he had something to gain, but when it was the most terrifying option available to him. That kind of honesty, the kind that cost you something real, is a form of integrity I have more respect for than the kind that was never tested. And then there is what he built quietly, without recognition, over those same 9 years. He became genuinely good at his work. He earned trust from colleagues. He developed expertise that no piece of paper had handed him. That is its own kind of intelligence. The practical, hard-won kind that comes from showing up repeatedly in the same place and paying attention. It was never worthless. It was just invisible to the people whose opinion mattered most to him. My father understood this immediately. That did not surprise me, once it happened. The people who have built things with their hands, who have shown up to difficult work without being celebrated for it, tend to recognize that quality in others. I think about what it takes to carry something like that alone for nearly a decade, and then set it down. To walk into a room where the stakes are that high and say the true thing anyway. That is not nothing. That is in fact one of the harder things a person can do. I don't know what my brother's life looks like 5 years from now. I know he is still in Vancouver. I know he is looking at programs. I know he calls our parents on Sundays, same as always, except the calls are different now. Looser, longer. Something genuinely exchanged rather than carefully managed. That Sunday call, that is what I keep coming back to. He never stopped making it. Even when the lie was at its heaviest, he kept showing up. That, I think, was the part of him that was always worth saving.